Welcome. I am Kathy Cohen, a professor at the University of Chicago and one of the conveners with Andrew Russell and Andrea Zevnik of an international group of scholars focused on the topic of race, age, and populism. This group is the host of today's webinar. We are particularly interested as a group in how race and age shapes one's interest in and response to populist appeals and politics. We're also exploring the relevance of the concept of populism today and its current dimensions. For example, given the presence of a right-wing conservatism tied to populism around the world, should we understand populism as fundamentally anti-Black and anti-immigrant? Moreover, who is allowed to constitute the people in those movements deemed populist? And to what extent might there be a left and multiracial populism that centers BIPOC communities where people of color are centrally the people? Today, we have a group of brilliant scholars to engage some of these questions and more broadly, the topic of race and populism. Gary Younge, Tianna Paschel, Laura Grattan, Robbie Shilliam. Gary, luckily for all of us, has agreed to serve as moderator today. But before I introduce Gary and turn it over to him, I want to thank the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture and the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, 3CT, for their co-sponsorship and support. I also want to thank Samhita Krishnan and Jonathan Likes for their administrative support. So finally, Gary. Gary deserves a much more elaborated introduction, but because we have less than an hour to be together, I'll just remind us that Gary is an award-winning author, broadcaster, and professor of sociology at the University of Manchester in England. He was a longtime columnist at The Guardian. Currently, he's on the editorial board of The Nation magazine and the Alfred Nobler Fellow for Type Media. He has written 5 books in his spare time and has had his work published in numerous popular media outlets. We are in good hands with this panel. Gary, I'm going to turn it over to you. It is all yours.
Thank you, Kathy. And without further ado, wherever you are, it's nearly 9:10 in the evening where I am, but I'm pretty sure we span a number of time zones. I'm going to introduce our panelists who are going to speak each for 5 minutes on the subject of their work and thoughts about race and populism. That'll be followed by a roundtable discussion. And then there'll be 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. We have Laura Grattan, an associate professor of political science at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. Laura is the author of Populism's Power, Radical Grassroots Democracy in America. She analyzes populist rhetoric and organizing in popular culture and in historical and contemporary social movements. We're also joined by Tianna Paschel, who is an associate professor at UC Berkeley in California. She focuses on the intersection of race ideology, politics, and globalization, particularly in Latin America. Tianna is also the author of Becoming Black Political Subjects, which explores the relatively recent shift to multicultural citizenship regimes and the recognition of specific rights for Black populations by Latin American states. And last, but by no means least, we have Professor Robbie Shilliam of Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, who researches the political and intellectual complicities of colonialism and race in the global order. Robbie is the author of both Race and the Undeserving Poor, and more recently, Decolonizing Politics, an Introduction. There is more that I could say about all of them, but for now, I'm going to let them speak for themselves. Thank you. If we go in the order that I mentioned you, so Laura, if you go first.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. And I want to start also by thanking Kathy and the conveners of this working group for the chance to be here and take part in this panel today. I want to argue that populist coalitions are one key site for organizing broad-based popular power to contest racial capitalism's dominance across economic, cultural, political, and ecological life. This claim may seem jarring given what we know of populism's history in the United States. Even on the left, populist movements have tended to reinforce white heteromasculinity. Populism's counter-hegemonic discourse, which pits the people against its adversary, is constructed in fields of legibility that are structured in whiteness and heteromasculinity. This means feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial demands can get lost in appeals for recognition, which are often rendered in masculinist, race-neutral terms that legitimize US sovereignty. Given this, to understand left populism's emancipatory potential, we need to look to its margins. Black radicals, immigrants, and other actors at the extreme margins have always taken part in broad-based populist left movements in the United States. We can look to immigrant socialists and Black populists in the 19th century populist movement, Black militants and the Popular Front of the New Deal, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and other youth activists in the Civil Rights Movement, queer and people of color affinity groups in Occupy, the Movement for Black Lives and immigrant justice activists who radicalized Bernie Sanders' populist campaign, and Indigenous activists who have forced decolonization to the center of debates over the Green New Deal. These activists have drawn on their own organizing strategies, their own grassroots power bases, and their own visions to contest and shape populist strategy and imagination in concrete ways. To write them out of history is to miss key things about populism and politics from the margins. First, it reinforces mainstream discourses that obscure populism's multiracial efforts historically and today to counter white nationalism and racial capitalism. And by painting both left and right populisms as dangerous and unrealistic, these mainstream critiques ask us to settle for modest reforms that do little to challenge the status quo. Second, this tendency to reframe populism from the center erases key actors and movements that we could count as populist and that can help us understand what populism is and can be. Aaron Pineda argues, or asks, is the problem that US populism is inherently white, or that we've been studying white populism and calling it populism, mistaking the provincial for the universal? In painting the civil rights movement as the nation's longest populist movement, Pineda argues that it mobilized Black people who bore the brunt of racial and economic violence in the US behind the belief, quoting Fannie Lou Hamer, that nobody is free until everyone is free. Third, writing multiracial cross-border feminist and queer actors out of populism delegitimizes the visions of marginalized actors who've repeatedly sought to radicalize broad-based populist movements as one strategy for more revolutionary change. And I think this is an ongoing strategy used by the Movement for Black Lives, abolitionists, and Indigenous activists today. So when we imagine populism from its margins, we can better organize its emancipatory potential. Rather than appealing to the people or peoplehood in static terms, we can see that multiracial populists engage in strategies of peopling or ongoing, active, negotiated practices of constituting collective identity and popular power. This means understanding populist politics as coalition politics, rather than as campaigns or movements in which individuals identify with some symbolic representation of the people, be it Bernie Sanders or the Green New Deal or whatever. So in populist coalitions, we can look to decentered sites of mutual aid, organizing, and institution building as sites for incubating radical practices and visions of the people and of democracy, and for building the power to contest and shape the direction of larger populist movements. But this also requires amplifying strategies of disruption and disidentification in populist coalitions that aim to build broad-based, multiracial popular identification. And a recent example of this is the Movement for Black Lives, which protested Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign events, forcing the campaign to acknowledge the racial disparities within capitalism and to create an ambitious platform against police violence and mass incarceration. And there are many more examples of the same. Now, the social field is more polarized than when I first began studying populism 15 years ago, and then when I published my book about 6 years ago. On the one side, the far right is more organized, and its deeply exclusionary and violent vision of democracy or fascism has alarming influence on the Republican Party. On the other side, though, the last decade and change have seen a dramatic rise in the US in movements led by young people of color, immigrant youth who were radicalized in their campaign for the DREAM Act and DACA and have gone on to lead the struggle to abolish ICE, the Movement for Black Lives, police and prison abolitionism, and Indigenous struggles from Standing Rock to the Red New Deal to Land Back. Some of their demands strain the limits of populist coalition. especially as they center settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and racialized gendered state violence as non-negotiable sites of antagonism. But I want to argue in closing that the radical imagination of these movements has also identified some key sites for broad-based multiracial struggle going forward. A few examples. The movement for Black Lives, Vision for Black Lives, and its organizing in cities from Chicago to Durham to Minneapolis and more have fueled local and state campaigns for participatory budgeting, divest, invest strategies, and reimagining community safety that have resonance to a broad base of citizens. Workers and communities on the front line of the pandemic have organized job walk-offs, strikes, and an eviction moratorium campaign that has achieved national attention and support. Indigenous, decolonial, abolitionist, and environmental movements have named extractivism as a problem of racial capitalism that impacts everyone, albeit differently. Ruth Wilson Gilmore speaks and writes powerfully about the ways in which the extraction of land, resources, labor, and time for capital gain can become sites of struggle that might bring together mothers fighting incarceration, working class people who never saw the promised fruits of building a new prison in their town, and Indigenous people fighting to get their land back. Similarly, the Just Transition Framework put out by Movement Generation and the Indigenous Environmental Network offers incredible resources for shifting from extractive economy to regenerative economy that could profoundly change work for everyone. And finally, though not finally, the fight for climate justice offers myriad sites for coalition between environmental activists, community organizing against environmental racism, and Indigenous and decolonial scholars. I know there are many more examples. And I close with these, even as they do stretch the limits of populism, because I think they can be sites for coalitional struggle here and there that can begin to build the kinds of coalitions needed for radical democratic social movements. Thank you.
And now, Tianna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was great. It was a great place to start as well. I really admire your work, and I think you put a lot of the conceptual and also empirical kind of groundwork to think through some of these questions. I'd like to thank Kathy, Andrea, and Andrew for the invitation to be here today, as well as Jonathan and Samhita for all of your labor that allowed for us to actually come together across all these time zones. And shout out to my co-panelist and to Gary for moderating. So my comments are preliminary, and I'm just trying to think through these questions of like the question that sounds like it's at the center of this project, which is to kind of think about what currency, if at all, does the term populism have? If you're interested in more bottom-up, radical, anti-racist politics and populism, is that word bankrupt? And so I want to just start by just saying a little bit about the kinds of things that get conjured up when we think about populism in Latin America, which is, I think, a really important site through which to understand populisms, because I think not only is it a place in which radical leftist, coalitional, movement-based movements have actually gone into the electoral realm with varying success. But it's also a place where the far right has, of course, really reacted to that left tide in the region with vigor and violence, and has really taken over the continent in ways that we're hoping in 2022 might shift a bit. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the electoral dimension of these populist politics in this region, and to kind of think about some glimmers of hope in terms of the kind of more radical version of populisms that Laura brings up in the talk today, but also in the book. So much of the mainstream discourse about the rise of the far right in places like Brazil has really focused on it being a reaction to economic redistribution, right, that happened under leftist political parties like the Workers' Party in Brazil, a reaction to the corruption scandals that are politicized and complicated, reaction to the economic bust cycles, right, commodity bust cycles that really made the already sort of tentative project of redistribution even more under assault. But I think one of the elements of the sort of move to the right in Latin America that often gets dismissed primarily by Latin American elites is the racial dimensions and the racist dimensions. So I've argued in my work before that if we want to understand Brazil's far right, for example, that all we have to do, and the rise of Brazil's far right in the late 2010s and 2020, is we can look at the movement that comes together to quite violently overturn affirmative action in higher education. And that we can think about that as a sort of laboratory for the far right, right? So we see these different components of a right populism sort of incubated in that moment in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, and sort of culminating in 2006 with the circulation of this manifesto that that is called like something like we all want we're all part of the Brazilian Republic, but got circulated as the manifesto of the white elite for good reason, right? And so in that moment, we see all kinds of repertoires being appropriated from the left, as well as language, right? So I like to say that I think that Brazil's like right wing is more obsessed with Martin Luther King and a co-opted sanitized version of Martin Luther King than Fox News, because they put him in everything, right? So the sanitizing of the language of a republic, the language of a democracy, the language of we, the sort of ludic character of left politics in terms of how people show up on the street with humor and with like a party vibe, for lack of a better term. We see that with the right that springs up against affirmative action, and then later in all the politics that tries to and quite successfully removes Dilma Rousseff from office. And so we see these sort of repertoires being appropriated from the left. But I think one of the really interesting things about that moment is it's also a moment in which whiteness and kind of white identity sort of comes out of the closet in a context where there is this sort of refusal of racialism, right? There's some anti-racialism, and in a context where discourses of racial paradise and racial democracy have, of course, for over a century, sort of quieted any kind of anti-racist claim. And so one of the really interesting things is that the sort of covert anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity of yesteryear within this right movement is now sort of out in the open and overt. And I could give a million examples of that with Bolsonaro, but just imagine that, you know, Brazil's president is someone who affectionately refers to himself as the tropical Trump. And you could imagine some of the things that he said. But I want to spend a little time saying something about that other kind of populism that Laura speaks to in this important work, right? Which is that kind that is so vivid in the context of Latin American politics and so fraught, and also often the subject of so much violent repression. I think that we can look at in the electoral realm in the 90s, especially the rise of a kind of populism that does have some of those complicated features of being still just a bit too white, a little bit too masculinist, right? And examples like Brazil, Ecuador, and Bolivia. But the moment that we're living in now, right, which is a moment where people are seeing those small gains in terms of ethnic rights, human rights, reproductive rights, redistribution that came in the 90s with the pink tide. We see those gains being like obliterated, and the kinds of movements that are coming up in response to this pendulum swing to the right are movements that are led by Black movements, Black and Indigenous women are leading. And so I just want to say a little bit about that. I could give a lot of examples of this, but I think one of the things that is super interesting that's happening in Colombia and Brazil is really the ways in which the more old masculinized and like kind of labor specific left is having to step to the side in order to really build on the energy of massive populist politics that youth and everybody has inside of them and is like taking to the streets, right? And so we see, of course, the assassination of Marielle Franco as a key moment, right, in March of 2018, but also the sort of flowers that her unfortunate assassination bore, which is a bunch of Black women, some of which were close friends with Marielle, engaging and taking up those politics. We also see Francia Marquez Mina and a whole movement of Black and Indigenous peoples coming together with like more formal political parties in the context of the Pacto Histórico, or the historic like coalition of political parties that are movement-based, that comes together and is really has a lot of energy. And if I have, I don't know, Gary, if I have 1 minute, but I wanted to read 1 minute. Okay, so I wanted to read a little bit from the I Am Because We Are Ubuntu campaign that Francia Marquez Mina is leading. She is an activist from the north of Cauca, and I've interviewed her for my work, and she's a dear friend. But her work has been grassroots. It's been against extractivism, against dispossession, against racism, against sexism. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that that movement is trying to think about justice and democracy in a different way, not as something that is given by white men in power, but something that is birthed from below. And I'm just going to say say a little bit from one of the things that they put out, just to give you a sense of what they're trying to do. So they say the ethnic groups of Colombia are called to rebuild our history through a spiritual mandate. We warn those who have always ruled that we are not scared off by their colonial requirements, or the way they strut their inherited or ill-gotten titles, or by that look that historically has put us in the position of those who don't know or can't. We bring to Colombia the wisdom of the people know, without arrogant denial, who recognize the importance of dialogues between ancestral wisdom and scientific knowledge. This is the basis of our political agreements. Likewise, we bring the wisdom of the women of the rivers, seas, mountains, forests, and urban peripheries, the wisdom of people who historically have been violated, excluded, and dispossessed. So I just want to say that I think that there is absolutely all kinds of practices of populism that are absolutely from below and absolutely radical. And I think that we have to think critically about the electoral dimension of these in the context of Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Tianna. And with no further ado, I'm going to move on to Robbie. Robbie, please.
Thanks, Gary. And thanks to all the organisers of this project, which has been going on for some time, and it's really valiant the work that they've been putting into it over a period of time, man. So my take on populism is really based in the UK, and you know the national creed of the UK is basically defer to your masters. So I have a very, very skeptical kind of approach to populism as a analytic and as a politics. But what I love about this, and what I love about Tianna and Laura's presentations, is that you know it's really providing a very rich comparative kind of stretch of this, and it's great to be provincialized. So I'm going to provincialize myself even a bit more, man, and just talk about, which is my kind of hook into this, a book that I published in 2018 called Race and the Undeserving Poor, From Abolition to Brexit. And I started working on it the day after the Brexit referendum in 2016. And I wanted to contribute to sharpening left analysis of the return of class, you know, as a category, to parliamentary grammar, you know, after the 2008 financial crisis, because it had a long absence before that, especially when the Blair government replaced class with ideas of social cohesion. So the argument of the book is that ever since abolition debates in the 1780s, who is deserving of welfare and services, social services, has been variously racialized. the newfound deservedness of the white working class after the financial crisis in Britain has to be understood as part of this long history, wherein the deserving and undeserving distinction was hardly ever a signpost planted by autonomous populist politics, but almost always an elite artifact of political domination. In fact, in the British imperial context, the white working class in Britain only received material benefits as the white working class from 1948 to probably the aftermath of the miners' strikes in the 1980s. And after that, as well as before that, state, labor, and business did not articulate an organizational supremacy for workers racialized as white. And since the 80s, that white benefit has been more and more reduced to a claim on preferences for public services, housing and health especially. And that claim has often been filtered through a national xenophobic calculus, a calculus that obfuscates the fact that even at the local level, every elite enunciated concern for the white working class has been met with cutbacks to welfare and social security. So power cuts at the weakest fabric of the social, and when it comes to universal welfare, that's almost always meant cutting through the non-white Commonwealth resident and/or refugees and asylum seekers in the British context. And what gets made conditional for them ends up ultimately being made conditional for all. So I finished the book by arguing that the Grenfell Tower fire in London in 2017 is prescient of the post-Brexit future, both in terms of the localization of what Ruth Gilmore calls organized abandonment, a phrase aptly deployed to West Kensington by Brenda Banner, and what local organizer Dan Renwick calls callous indifference by the state. But Grenfell Tower is also prescient in terms of the future working class formations that the Corbyn project struggled to sight up and galvanize: multiracial, multinational, multi-religious, urban, and materially organized around precarious living environments. In the book and in a subsequent paper, I argued that the ideological position through which to sharpen the critique of faux elite-led populism was Enoch Powell, Britain's first neoliberal politician. And that's Aaron Condanley's point too. Powell saw empire, he was against empire. He saw empire sullying the orderly independence of English menfolk. Orderly independence was a racial inheritance of the capacity for independence by which they lived within their means and through the self-responsibilization of their fate, rather than living beyond their means through empire's ever-growing sterling imbalance sheet, or buying into the disorderly anarchy of Black peoples, or the irresponsible communalism of South Asian peoples, or the associated dependencies of socialism with its defense of universal welfare. In fact, Powell was clear: a free enterprise system should not be expected or required to produce endless economic growth. It wasn't actually about getting rich, but getting racially independent and unsullied. Now, think about all those spoilt grandchildren of Powell, those who replaced his ideological depth with short-term scamming sensibilities and pushed for Brexit, even if it was going to damage national growth, but not their own offshore accounts. These are the same grafters who have been eugenically callous enough to let their own white working class take the punch on the chin from a China virus. After all, if England's silent majority are really unsullied in terms of their genetic lineages, they'll survive it through their own resilience. So you just keep calm and carry on. Well, I finished the book in December 2017, and woo, a lot has happened since then. I do think we're living, at least those of us living in the Anglo-West, I think we're living through one of Stuart Hall's conjunctures. This time, crisis seems to be sedimenting on top of crisis, and then the sands regularly collapsing on each other. So I guess I'm kind of ending with a bit of humility. I don't know how much of my critique of elite populism has survived even the last 4 years. I think some of it has, but I don't even live in Britain anymore. So I'm hoping you guys can help me to catch up. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you, Robbie. You know, you really should stop pussyfooting around and say what you really think about this stuff, Robbie. I guess, of course. I just want to ask a few questions, really, to all of you, based on the things you said. Now, all of you, with Laura giving the most full-throated case for a kind of a multiracial left populism that has always been there, but we haven't kind of understood it as such. The point you made, Laura, that been studying white populism and calling it populism, and pointing out the civil rights movement was the most enduring populist project of the previous century, or maybe ever in America. Robbie, you mentioned that the Corbyn response. Tianna, you mentioned these responses to the obliteration of the gains that were made in previous decades. And I'm wondering, you spoke about the Tianna, the laboratory for the far right, this campaign against affirmative action. And so what I'm interested, or where I want to start, is by asking whether the left has such a laboratory, whether there is a place where either an ideological place or a policy place, it could be a geographical place, I guess, where the left is working on our own populism, or its own populism, and working through its own populism, which, phrased in a different way, because that's a precise question and there kind of almost certainly isn't a direct answer, is the left populist by intent or by accident when that does happen? Now, I don't mind who goes first, but I guess it would make sense to start with you, Laura, and then maybe I'll go to Robbie afterwards.
Thanks, and these are challenging questions, and I think I spoke with a full-throated defense of left populism, and I've always been incredibly ambivalent, even in writing the book, and I think the book was a process of working through that ambivalence. Subsequent projects have really questioned, say, for example, the Bernie Sanders People's Revolution and its ability to respond ever adequately to the challenges from the movement for Black Lives, right? But I think I hang on to populism on the left as a kind of politics, whether it's a concept or a category, because it is a site for thinking about critiques of democracy, right? Critiques of the way that elite institutions, whether they're neoliberal, whether they're white nationalist, whether they're elite populist, right, have dethroned the people, right? Have taken power away from the people. And so to me, populism is always left populisms, good ones, 19th century populist movement, I think even the Sanders campaign have begun as laboratories, right? The 19th century populist movement was a laboratory of farmers and, immigrant laborers in the Knights of Labor who were trying to practice self-determination, cooperative commonwealth, right? Cooperative practices on their farms. And in a sense, that bubbled up into the People's Party and electoral populist challenge because of circumstance, because the structural limitations in their place, wouldn't let their cooperative movement grow. And so it almost was a bubbling up of ideas that both began the electoral movement and radicalized it as it went, right? And I think today, examples of that for me, I think climate change really is one of the most exciting areas in the U.S. and internationally where this is happening, right? So, organizing around climate change, has its sort of national lens in the Green New Deal, but it bubbles up from all kinds of local and place-based activism, some of which are, green folks, some of which are Indigenous activists, and these are sites in which there are just everyday conversations and contests over, over who constitute the people, over what the direction of climate politics looks like, right? And I think something like, and I'll end here, something like I mentioned the movement generations just transition framework. It's something that actually provides a conceptual space and an organizing space to bring together these kinds of movements, bringing together the environmental challenges and organizing with people who are working on sites of extraction in labor, sites of extraction through prisons, sites of extraction, through finance capital and the like, to think about how to bring together their organizing, right, in ways that really bring out some of the more radical language, on critiques of extractivism led by Indigenous and decolonial struggles, right? So I think that there are all kinds of laboratories, right? If you think of populism not just as identification, but bubbling up of people power, right? There are all kinds of sites and laboratories that can coalesce through conceptual frameworks like the Green New Deal or the Just Transition.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to go to Robbie now, but I just want to add on, not really on the back, but kind of supplementary to what you were saying there, Laura, this challenge in a way of there are things like Black Lives Matter or a range of things that come out of the Black community or migrant communities or whatever, and then become populist. And then there are white populist projects that remember that they should be multiracial, and then think, oh yeah, what about the Black people?
Absolutely.
And they always seem to be, to me, the ones that really struggle, because the die is cast, and without breaking the mold, they try to kind of graft rather than to kind of remix. I'm going to stop with that metaphor, but you get my point. But because that felt to me like what happened with the Corbyn project, somewhat, Robbie, and the Sanders project to some extent. But in any case, Robbie, where?
Yeah, no, Gary, I think that's really important. And I guess I would, and it speaks to an issue about how we think about the relationship of movements to parties, right? So I mean, I think that Laura's definition I like, coalitional struggles. So my very English suspicion of populism. Yeah, but I like that coalitional struggle, right? I think that gets to the heart of what some of this is, especially on the left, right, and the challenge. And if I'm thinking about that, then I'm thinking in the when I think about the Grenfell Tower thing, then I
just want to stop you there, Robbie.
Yeah, man, go.
People, does everybody know what happened at the Grenfell Tower? You do. Just in case, Robbie, could you give a very brief kind of
Yeah. So it's a housing block in West Kensington. West Kensington is one of them parts of London which is incredibly bifurcated in terms of big international capital coming in and doing up half of the place, and then leaving the rest of the place in just impoverished, right? And the local council doing, basically conspiring to actually get rid of the poorer residents, right? As prime real estate, leading to, not directly, but leading to a criminally negligent, although that's going through an inquiry now, mishandling of maintenance on this tower block, which led to a fire, which was the biggest fire since I think it was the biggest urban catastrophe since the thing in Wales after the Second World War. But I mean, it was a huge thing, right? And the important thing about the Grenfell Tower building is that it's a stone's throw from Buckingham Palace. I mean, it's really close to power and privilege, right? But the peoples in it were very multi-racial, multinational, multi-religious, right? And they were not necessarily. They were that postcode or zip code was a what was in a kind of lower decile area, so it was impoverished area, but then the peoples in that postcode actually have a higher than average educational level, so it was actually genuinely quite aspirational, right? Some famous artists got killed in the fire, and all this kind of stuff, right? So that was what Grenfell Tower was about, and the reason I'm bringing that up when it comes to coalitional struggle is that the struggle before the fire, to the community struggle before the fire, and even during and after the fire, was incredibly localized, right? And so it didn't cleave so much along very abstract lines of race and class and religion and nationality. But what drew it together was actually, did you live in the area? Did you live in Grenfell Tower? Did you live in that postcode, right? And so when I was saying about the precarious living environments, that to me seems to be the laboratory, if you like, of where one might practice these coalitional struggles. Now, I'd like to hear from Tianna whether those, because I'm thinking just in the urban here, and whether in your research, Tianna, if that's sufficient to think of that kind of precarious living, coalitions just in the urban, right? But I mean, Corbyn the day after the fire was obviously authentically distraught and caring about them people. The Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, just stood across the road, with her kind of bodyguards, and then just buggered off again. So, but Corbyn couldn't deal with the locality issue, and neither could the other left formations. And they all came in and overrepresented Grenfell. All of them did, right? And so for me, then the question is, because you need to scale up those coalitional struggles, and was it you, Laura, or Tianna? I can't remember, who mentioned, Ruth Wilson's stuff about, in California, and her big point is, how do you scale that up, right? And, and when you scale that up, then you get into this tension between movements and parties. And, I think a lot of the issue with Corbyn, possibly with Bernie, I don't know, is that people who were well-versed in movements thought that is what you need to run a party, and to run a party in opposition, and to take power, and to take state power. And it absolutely is not. So, that's where I kind of leave the issue. I don't know.
Thank you, Robbie. As I go to you, Tianna, I also want to add this reflection about masculine men stepping aside. That what we have seen with these new kind of much more fast break movements is many more women, and actually many more queer women, taking leadership roles. So I don't know about Latin America, but that's certainly true in both in Britain and in America, and just the degree to which that is also part of the laboratory of what what the left is or might achieve.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to echo a little bit of what's already been said around the left always engaging in, what might be called abolitionism, utopianism. Like, how else do you go day to day? And I think in Latin America, it needs to be said that activist communities that do this work are like assassinated straight up, constantly, are living with death threats every day. And so in order to do this work, people do have to dream up the future, in the present always, and they have always done that. And so I think we can think about that as laboratories of kinds, right? To kind of think about what kind of society you want to build in the asamblea or like the meetings of a community as like a laboratory for thinking about like what a democratic practice looks like, what it means to represent people, right? And if you go to any of these meetings, which I've gone to many, like half of the meeting is about procedure. And early on in my research, I was like, "Ooh, we're not getting to the stuff yet. Like, when are we gonna get to stuff? Like, this is like 4 hours in, and we're like, the comrade here, this, and like, wait, where's the substance?" But the truth is that was the substance, right? Like, and I think that the practices as well as the you mentioned that Gary, the ideas, like the ideologies of the movements and how we can think about the laboratories there too. And I think certainly the kind of epistemological perspectives that these movements are bringing in the context of like what otherwise are these bankrupt ideas of the state and state power and democracy, and bankrupt, like everybody knows it. Like, it's not like just the left, like people are on the streets because they know that there's something wrong here. And I think in terms of like what can be done about that, there's a lot of thinking through. There's a lot, and I'll just mention one of those sort of epistemological conceptual things that I see in the context of Colombia, not from, as Robbie put it, like the urban spaces, but the rural spaces, which are where like, accumulation by dispossession is happening most violently. But just the concept of territoriality, right? Like, and not commodify land, to think about land as a thing that makes life possible and all kinds of life as a way into thinking about environmental crisis of capitalism, racial injustice and racial capitalism and heteropatriarchy, right? Like, I think that there's a way in which the utopian projects and the concepts that come from the ground up can help think about these questions. I would say that the thing that is sort of to Gilmore's point about scale, that is the kind of worrisome part, is really just if state power itself is, and the apparatus of the state is too sullied to ever, like, it's not just scale, it's like there, like, once you touch that thing, it distorts, right? Necessarily. And I'm not just thinking about like power and the exercise of power, the fact that like you will be repressed. Taliria Petroni, which was one of Marielle Franco's best friends, who's also a local elected official, has been in hiding because like people have been arrested because there was an actual attempt on her life. That will happen. But beyond even that, like the exercise of power, there's these questions of if state power as we know it can even understand and see the kind of practices and ideologies of these populist movements. Like, I think a lot about Francia Marquez Mina, who is constantly telling people to stop saying her candidacy. Like, every time people are like, tell me about your candidacy. And she's like, nuestra, like, it's our candidacy. And like, even the people who love her the most can't make that switch. And so the question becomes like, can you even see collectivist practices? Is there even a space in the formal electoral politics for a collective, right? Like, beyond the charismatic, like, individual leaders? I don't know. And I think there's going to be a test of that in the next election cycles in Latin America, for sure.
So we're running out of time. I mean, we only really have time for one question from the audience, which I'm going to put to you. And as I put it to you, I'm going to ask you also to kind of wrap up your thoughts. And this is from Amal Abubakar, or Bakare. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. He says, how are populist movements separate from the policy elite when the people power falls in line or emanates from institutional agendas? Brexit, Trumpism, and old stock Canada. Is there a way to draw a line? Can a line be drawn, or do they feed into each other? Which touches on the notion of like, what is it when the people, quote unquote, want the wrong thing? or line up with vested interests. So I'm going to ask you about that and ask you, we have 6 minutes, so with some kind of discipline to also just give us your concluding thoughts. And I'll start with you, Robbie.
Oh, well, Amar's question is the question I have about populism, but again, with the recognition that these are very context-specific things. So I would say there is no difference, but that's only from the things that I've seen, and I know that there are different histories and different formations. So I do want to acknowledge that, right, and maybe think more about what is it that we think is special about populism, and kind of decode that and work with that, right, rather than the label, yeah. Because obviously elite populism is not populism. So and then very briefly,
an elite agenda that is embraced by a large number of people.
Yeah,
maybe a version of populism.
No, I get you, Gary. I get you. I mean, right now, I'm still amazed at the degree to which there has been a lack of mobilization of those people by the elites, even in the US. I mean, I know people do it all under the cover. I'm not stupid, but that thing that was happening on the weekend, there's hardly anybody there, right? So, like, I'm not saying other stuff is happening, but that to me is an interesting dilemma, actually, right? So there's that, and then just very, very briefly, I am caught up in this thing about scale at the moment. Like the book I wrote before that Brexit book was nothing about the state. It was all about indigenous politics, hookups with Black Power and Rastafari in the Pacific, or the good anti-colonial stuff, and I still stand by that. But if one thing has humbled me in the last 5 or 6 years, it's like party politics matters, man. And I know that's a stupid thing to say. I'm a political scientist, right? But the fact that in political science, and Kathy knows this, so much of the scholarship which focuses on formal politics is literally apolitical. You know what I mean? So you can't even get at politics through political science, which is what led me and so many other people to say, well, screw party politics, because there's nothing there to think about. But the old adage, you don't care about the state, but the state cares about you. Right? So that's where I'm caught up at the moment. I can't lie. I'm caught up in that distinction between movement and party, and the need to scale up, and the need to conquer, man. And I know that sounds very masculine, but I'm just saying the other side are all about conquering.
Thank you, Robbie. Tianna.
Thank you so much. This has been a really generative conversation. I guess to the question that was asked, I think there is a sort of, at least in the context of many Latin American countries in this last 20-year period, there's a direct relationship between these different kinds of populism. And that's what I was trying to say, which is that there's the sort of dialectic, there's a pendulum swing that goes back and forth. And I think that particular relationship, right, of reactionary, like any kind of expansion of anything, even modest, in terms of rights, in terms of material gains, gets squashed and things go to the other side, which with the support of large swaths of the population. And I want to say that support of large swaths that makes this, even if it's elite driven, not entirely elite as a project, right? The far right populisms in Latin America is really only possible in a world that's organized economically, that assumes that there's scarcity at the bottom, right? And that people have to actually make these trade-offs that would not necessarily have to happen under a different kind of model. And it can only happen in a world in which Black people and Indigenous people are not yet fully human in the kind of mainstream ideologies of a place. Those two things are what makes the populism go back and forth. And until those two are solved, I'm not sure that we'll be in a world where right-wing populism doesn't just keep coming back, especially after something has happened, even slightly radical on the left.
Finally, Laura.
I think Tianna's last point there is one that just to kind of keep in the forefront as we're thinking about what left populisms can do and left radical movements and their strategies vis-a-vis government, right? Because the alternative side, at least in the US, and I know other places, is far more organized. I think to answer the question that was asked, I don't want to romanticize people power. I think in my response earlier I did, but in many cases, I think in the U.S. the Tea Party is a great example of nationalist people power, right? And there was a real astroturf. There was a real grassroots element of that movement, an organized element, even as there was an astroturf element run by elites, right? But you can see even in that the base building on the right held the elites to account. For example, the Freedom Works and others wanted this to be a neoliberal capitalist movement, and the base made it into a nationalist capitalist movement, right? Neoliberal capitalist movement. And similarly, even with Trump, some of his most ardent far right supporters are now some of his biggest critics, right? At least on the right. And so I think that even within the right, the people power isn't always democratic, but it can hold, if it's organized, hold elites to account. And then pivoting, to the question we were asking earlier, I always have trouble thinking about broad-based populisms reaching the national electoral arena, right? So in response to Gary, there are those movements like Occupy, and Bernie's contestable because he was made possible by people of color movements on the bottom, right? He wouldn't have been there without them. But to the extent that he missed a lot and his campaign missed a lot, there's also the problem of the populisms that bubble up when radical indigenous, abolitionist, and other movements choose to engage in broad-based populist politics as a strategy, right? And when they do that, there's still the limits of legibility, so that I've been talking about the Red New Deal, the Green New Deal can't even get out there in the national arena, right? Or something like defund is dead in the water for Democrats right now. And so I think this question of scaling up has always been hard for me when it gets to the national electoral legislative arena, and why I tend to look to issue-based organizing, coalitional politics that can make gains. And my, excuse me, I guess my last thought here is, I do think there's an acceptance of the limits of state democracy when populist campaigns, and any campaign, including abolitionist campaigns, engage in the electoral and legislative arena, right? There's a romanticization around Bernie or around a broad-based populist campaign that just doesn't need to be there, right? I think you can see it in clear-eyed terms as making the state better in order to, not better, but a site for ongoing struggles. And I think in some cases that's the best that populism can do at the national level, or maybe any politics.
Well, look, it's been a brilliant conversation. I'm really happy with the fact that it raised more questions than answers in terms of delivering really simplistic questions, which would not have helped us. And as Tianna said, this is a life and death issue in some parts of the world. This is not something that we should be playing with or kind of using as some kind of sloganeering. But the degree to which one can and should scale up, the relationship between political parties, the range of laboratories that already exist and are incubating a range of ways of being, ways of being both kind of active and practical, and that dialectic both on the left and right between the populist base and whoever or whatever presents itself as the leadership of that base are some of the kind of central questions that I think we've raised. I want to thank Laura, Robbie, and Tianna. I want to thank Kathy and also the administrators that have made this possible. We, for all the discipline that there might be on the left, time is not one of them. We are over time and we are out of time. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and with that, bid you farewell. Thank you very much.